Lovely. Right, hello. Welcome back from your quick break, and I really hope everyone's been having a truly fantastic and interesting day. The parts I've managed to catch have been really absolutely fabulous. Thank you so much for having us. My name's Amanda. I'm one of the co-founders of For Our Future's Sake, or FFS, aptly named, one of the youth groups that kind of makes up the People's Vote campaign, and I know you've heard from a couple of our campaigners and activists throughout the day. So kind of wanted to just quickly reflect on today a little bit and actually focus on not only has it been great and genuinely, truly fabulous, but that it's been slightly different. It's featured lots of young people, lots of women, lots of people from outside London, members of parliament, non-members of parliament. And I think that's one thing we'll hopefully all maybe touch on a little bit when we're looking at how this whole debate goes forward. It's something that we should really keep trying to reflect in every aspect of what all of us are discussing in any campaigning that we're doing. So, very lucky today to be joined by two very well-known and very wonderful people in both of their aspects. And I will allow them both to introduce themselves briefly. And first, we're going to start with Jonathan Coe. So, hoping that Jonathan will obviously introduce yourself and kind of reflect on how you've come here today, but also maybe a bit on why your book, Middle England, is actually viewed the way it is in our current situation as a society.
Thank you very much. My mic's not turned on.
But we'll just turn the mics on first, just so... Yeah. There we go. Better?
Can everyone hear me now? Yeah. Well, how did I come to be here, and how did I come to write this novel, Middle England? I've been doing quite a lot of public events recently to more or less to promote this book. This is by far the most terrifying and intimidating event I've been to, I have to say. The kind of throb of political expertise in this room is overpowering. So really, I came here to listen. They sent me a rough outline of who was going to be on the program, and I thought, you know, Carol Cadwallader, Caroline Lucas, Nick Cohen, Peter Jukes, all these people who I've been reading on Brexit for the last 2.5 years, and in some cases listening to, but the opportunity to meet these people, to hear them, to kind of take in a bit of their energy was just too tempting to resist. And I feel very out of my depth because I'm not really a public speaker, and some of the speaking today, I think, has been incredible and tremendously energizing. I mean, Fintan O'Toole, for instance. I mean, this is a man who. This is a man who doesn't just seem to have kissed the Blarney Stone, but had full penetrative sex with it, I would say. Anyway, turning to fiction. Another speaker who really inspired me this morning was Stella Creasy, and she very directly and specifically answered one of the questions from the floor about how a second referendum campaign, if such a thing were to happen, were to be conducted. And she said very rightly, I think, that the way to sway floating voters was not to tell them they were wrong the first time, not the way to tell them they were stupid the first time, but to try and find common ground and to try not to be condescending. And my novel, Middle England, had many, many different starting points which all came together into this book, but because I'm not so good at speaking, but I can read, I'm going to read just half a page from the book, which is germane to this. Here we have a married couple called Sophie and Ian, who are having a birthday dinner with Ian's mother, Helena. And Ian has just had a meeting at work where he's had to report to his superior, who is an Asian woman, whose job he feels he should be doing. His wife asks him, how did it go? He says, oh, it was fantastic. If you like being patronized and talked down to by someone who used to be your colleague and who's sitting behind the desk you should be sitting behind, it was just great. And that's why you're in such a nasty mood. Isn't it about time you got over that blow to your male ego and moved on? My male ego. There you go. Why not just my ego? No, you have to make it about me being a man. You'll be talking about my white privilege next. Go on, tell me how fucking privileged I am. Tell me that people like me haven't become victims in our own country. Sophie glanced across at Helena, who was staring at them, horrified, most of the food uneaten on her plate. She felt suddenly ashamed. Now you're being stupid, she said. And we shouldn't be talking like this on your mother's birthday. I'm sorry, Helena. No, you shouldn't. Helena put down her knife and fork. Would you excuse me for a moment? I'm going to find the ladies. She pushed back her chair and made her way slowly to the back of the restaurant. Ian and Sophie ate in silence for a while. Don't you think you could dial it down a bit? Sophie asked eventually, for her sake, tonight at least. She agrees with me, you know. She's on my side. When did it become about sides? Ian looked at her directly and said bitterly, you have no idea, have you? No idea about what? About how angry it makes us feel, this air of moral superiority you lot project all the time. Sophie interrupted him. I'm sorry, but who are these people? Who's us? Who's you lot? Instead of answering this question, Ian posed another one. Which way do you think the referendum's going to go? Don't change the subject. I'm not. Which way do you think it's going to go? Sophie could see that he meant to persist with this line of inquiry. She blew out her cheeks and said, I don't know, Remain, probably. Ian gave a satisfied smile and shook his head. Wrong, he said. Leave is going to win. Do you know why? Sophie shook her head. People like you, he said, with a note of quiet triumph, and then he repeated with a jab of his finger, people like you. Just to give you a little bit of background to that passage, I had a conversation after the referendum, shortly after the referendum, with a friend of mine, a working class guy, academic, who lives in Enfield in East London, and he used to be a Labour supporter, voted UKIP in the last couple of elections, and I was surprised by the referendum result. I told him that. He said I wasn't surprised. And he said everybody around where I live was going to vote Leave. That was obvious. And I said to him, why is that, do you think? And he looked at me and said, people like you. And that was the moment when the idea of writing a book about the referendum, which had been bubbling away in me for a few months, came to the surface. And I thought, yes, I have to find out what he meant by that comment and what this is all about. So there you go.
Oh, thank you. So as someone who runs a youth campaign, I can definitely affiliate the feeling of people pointing at us and saying it's because of people like you. And I think somebody else who can probably relate to that quite a lot is my other guest, James from LBC, one of the kind of ever-growing popular shows. Proves my point slightly. And kind of the same, hopefully, from James, kind of introduce yourself and explain how you came to where you are, and also reflect slightly on your very interesting book and why you think maybe that is seen in the way it is in today's current situation.
You can tell who the proper author is on this stage and who is the newcomer, because I haven't brought a copy of my own book with me. This is my first mistake, obviously.
You have to hold it up to the audience.
If this goes badly, I'll read a bit of yours as well. I have this odd position, which I didn't realise really was odd, or arguably even unique, in that I spent a significant period of not just the last 2.5 years, but prior to that as well, speaking to precisely the people that people like us are often accused of ignoring. And it's why I'm slightly uncomfortable with the suggestion that we shouldn't be condescending or we shouldn't call people stupid, because you will be accused of doing that however you treat a lot of these people. They will tell you that you're condescending and sneering because you have had the audacity to prove them wrong about something and make them feel stupid. It doesn't mean that you think they are stupid. It means they have just done a stupid thing. In my case, in public, on the radio, in front of 1 million listeners a week. And then, of course, the clips go viral, and that's yet more evidence of the sneering, metropolitan, condescending elite because, I don't know, the internet. And what has been astonishing to me is how from a relatively inarticulate caller to a radio station right up to the big beasts of Brexit, and one thinks not just of the sort of pretend politicians like Farage, but the cabinet level politicians like David Davis. Boris Johnson, I think, is unique in the sense that he doesn't actually believe anything. But David Davis genuinely, well, except in the wonderfulness of Boris Johnson and his God-given right to be Prime Minister. But David Davis apparently did believe that this could somehow have gone well. And so this issue of condescension and sneering is fascinating to me because David Davis is stupid. And I think if we're to learn lessons for a possible second vote, then pick on the really big, stupid people. Don't pick upon the inarticulate callers to radio stations or posit the notion that everybody who voted a certain way must be intellectually deficient. We're quite a deferential nation, I've discovered in the last few years. It's come as a big surprise to me. I thought everyone was raised like my mum and dad raised me, which is to believe you're as good as anyone and you've got as much right to go anywhere as anybody else has. But when you see a pantomime toff like Jacob Rees-Mogg treated as a form of sort of aristocratic second coming, you realize that a significant swathe of the population does actually want to doff its cap and tug its forelock at its betters. And that is okay as a system for society, as long as the person that you're doffing your cap at and tugging your forelock at is not a liar. Unfortunately, they all are. And again, it's neither condescending nor sneering nor arrogant to say so. The lies have become so utterly part of the modern conversation that you sometimes even forget yourself. It's like Donald Trump, but on a curiously British scale. So when they claim that the reason, just off the top of my head very recently, Rees-Mogg will claim that the problems regarding the Irish border have been caused by the obdurate Irish government. He will, of course, claim in the space of a week that Theresa May's position has become so untenable that he's decided to launch the world's crappiest coup. And then a week later, he feels he has no choice but to offer up his unalloyed support to her. And she's not changed one iota in the intervening week. So the man is literally arguing that black is black on Monday and that black is white a week later. And it's not been called out. David Davis, within days of the referendum result coming in, said he would be in Berlin negotiating a trade deal, not in Brussels. Now, that demonstrates an ignorant... And Theresa May then appointed him Secretary of State for leaving the European Union. It's not condescending to point that out, it's history. And of course, what that comment demonstrated was a profound ignorance of how the single market worked. It was something, I mean, this simple fact that you cannot negotiate as an individual market or as an individual entity. You can only negotiate that collectively. It's something that's so easy to understand. Angela Merkel only had to explain it to Donald Trump 13 times. And that seems to me to be a big part of the problems that we've unearthed. It is the people like you line is, I mean, it echoes around the country, but that's a what, it's not a why. Why is it the problem of people like you or like me or like us? Ask them why. And that's when the truths start to emerge. And the truths, sadly, are built largely on prejudice and ignorance. So I'll give you an example of something that the Prime Minister says now, but which used to be confined to the corners of the country occupied exclusively by UKIP and their sympathisers. This phrase, we can't control our money, our borders, and our laws. Now, I hear that on the Today programme most mornings, a flagship political programme or current affairs programme in this country for all of my lifetime, and it goes unchallenged. Let's break it down very, very briefly in a way that no presenter of the Today programme has ever bothered to do, because, and that's, I mean, there's a criticism implicit in what I just said, but I'll briefly explain in a moment why It's a criticism I actually understand. So we can't control our money. What money? No one ever says that. What money? Do you mean the, 0.7% of national expenditure that is sent to the European Union as the result of a decision taken and continued by several successive governments of different political hues? Is that the money? Because it sounds like you're suggesting we can't control any of our money. What you're talking about is 47 pence per person per day? I mean, a smaller part of our national expenditure than when you see the pie chart of where your tax take goes. Is that what you're talking? That money, that's the money we can't control. What do you mean when we say we can't control it? So you've asked them what money means. Now you ask them what control means, because it gets sent to Brussels, so we can't control it. Does that mean the money we send to NATO? Is that money we can't control as well? These are not complicated questions, and I still don't fully understand why they never get asked. But the reason why they get repeated and trotted out all the time is because they're so powerful. It's the British equivalent or the Brexit equivalent of Make America Great Again. We can't control our money, our borders, and our laws. Well, we've established what money you're actually talking about and what a fatuous comment that is to make, Prime Minister. We're concerned about precisely what it is you mean by control, so let's take the word control and apply it to borders. I didn't know, to my shame, before that referendum was conducted, about the relevant, I think it's Femi's on later, isn't he? Femi's coming in.
Or has been on,
well, I owe it to Femi Olawule for bringing me up to speed with what the Charters govern in terms of immigration, and the fact that we could have had much more stringent regulations in, if you really wanted them, which I don't, but if you really wanted them, you could have had them. So we can control our borders more than we currently do. We do control our money, and then of course laws, which is the real reason why I'm here today. Because I discovered about 4 years ago that when someone is screaming at you about how awful the European Union is, and how they impose their laws upon us from without, and have robbed us of autonomy and sovereignty and independence, there is one very simple question you can ask every single one of them, which is this: what is the law you detest so much that you can't wait to wake up on the morning after Brexit and no longer have to obey it?
Very interesting. I think everybody will agree. And we'll come back in a second to James's opinion on journalism throughout the kind of Brexit debate that we've been having. But firstly, quite timely, obviously, with the Brexit film kind of coming out a few days ago. A very well-timed film, some could say. But I actually just wanted to go to Jonathan and just wonder if you could have a think and maybe just chat through what you think, how are the arts actually going to respond to Brexit when it's been such a mash of facts presented as fiction and fiction as facts and all over the place already? And that film has been both praised and criticised already. And what do you think is going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years in relation to the arts and Brexit?
Well, if Brexit goes ahead and we leave the European Union, or even if we don't actually, well, I mean, whichever way it goes, we're going to be a bitterly divided nation for the next decade or two, I would say. And, looked at purely from the writer's selfish point of view, this is a good thing. I mean, division and conflict is good for narrative.
Brilliant.
And, the last real resurgence, some people might argue, in the English novel, maybe the British novel, was in the 1980s when writers like Salman Rushdie and Alistair Gray and Jeanette Woodson and Angela Carter and others started reacting to Thatcherism. And Thatcherism was a profound creative spur on the arts. So I predict a lot. I mean, mine isn't even the first novel that deals with Brexit, and several others have come out at around the same time, and I predict there will be many more. I remember when the referendum was first, when the campaign was first kicking off, I was asked by a French journalist, are you going to be campaigning yourself? Are you going to be writing articles for the papers and this kind of thing? And I said, well, I will do what I'm asked to do, but writers aren't asked to do this kind of thing very much in the UK. And the political views of writers, Terry Eagleton famously said a few years ago that the political opinions of a writer are of no more interest than the political opinions of a window cleaner. And although Terry Eagleton is Irish, that's a very English way of looking at writers, I think, whereas when you go abroad to France or Germany or Italy, you feel an immediate sea change, and people come to you expecting a kind of political wisdom. The writer is a kind of guru figure in some countries. But I said to the journalist, well, I don't expect to be asked very much, but writers should be, actually, because I think that this campaign is going to be fought on emotions. And writers and artists are more used to dealing with the inner life, the emotional life, which is where a lot of this movement and persuasion is actually going to have to take place, than journalists or possibly politicians. And that's why I found what James was saying so interesting, because I remember a clip of your show which also went viral, where you'd done this fantastic thing that you do of pointing out to people, which asking them, putting them on the spot, which particular law is it that you don't that you want to shake off, and that kind of thing. And you had a caller who said, yes, but Brexit is a feeling.
Yes.
And I thought that was a really interesting statement. And Aaron Banks famously said that the Remain campaign lost because they dealt in facts and figures and arguments, and Leave won because it appealed to people's emotions. So I can't remember what it was you said to him about that actually in response.
Well, nor can I. I mean, the shift from political to psychological happened almost immediately after the vote, but it's rare for people to admit it like that. Because
yes, that was what stood out about it.
It's how I feel.
Yeah.
And I think I said something pithy and brilliant.
and memorable.
Well, clearly very memorable also.
Well, I am going to ask you to try and remember just a couple of things, James.
I probably asked him what else he felt we should legislate on according to people's feelings. And that would have been a moment. That's what I do now, anyway. And that would hopefully have highlighted to him what an unsatisfactory rationale it was for the single most important political project of our lifetimes. I just feel bad about stuff.
Yes.
But you can't. This is why I'm so uncomfortable with the condescension conversation. I don't know where to go on it, because do you condescend to him? Do you treat him the same as I had Sir Paul Nurse in the studio not long ago, who's head of the Royal Academy, isn't he? But more importantly, he's won a Nobel Prize for science. That's quite a good qualification for science. And he was explaining the impact that Brexit would have upon research in the context of science, for which he's won a Nobel Prize. And the caller, like the one Jonathan refers to, within 2-3 minutes of Sir Paul leaving the studio, I had people on the phone claiming that they knew more about science than Sir Paul Nurse. In the same way that Andrew Bridgen knows more about manufacturing cars than the head of Jaguar Land Rover, Jacob Rees-Mogg knows more about the Irish border than everybody in Ireland, and Nadine Dorries knows more about everything than everyone.
That thing that Michael Gove said,
yes,
that we've had enough of experts, a completely stupid statement, but actually one of the defining moments of the campaign, I think.
He called it.
Struck an incredible chord.
Yes, he did. I mean, I think he would argue that what he actually said was we've had a lot of experts from organisations with funny acronyms or something like that, but it's like that Thatcher quote about society, isn't it? It seemed to speak to a deeper truth than anyone acknowledged at the time.
Actually, was a kind of echo of what John Major said all those years ago. John Major, who kind of paradoxically is now a sort of hero of Remain, and someone we would all love to have as our Prime Minister again, but didn't he say on some social issue that we should try to understand a little less and condemn a little more?
That rings a bell.
Yeah,
yes.
which is speaking to the same kind of suspicion.
But I wonder, but this was at the time in British political history when Kelvin Mackenzie was boasting about how he would phone up John Major and tell him that he was going to empty a bucket of manure over his metaphorical desk the next morning. And I think that was Oh, Christ, it shows how messy British politics has become that we're sitting here feeling nostalgic for the Cones hotline and defending John Major. I suspect that was the kind of comment that John Major would make in the hope of keeping Kelvin Mackenzie at bay. Yeah. And in many ways, trying to keep these people at bay, these ferocious populist right-wingers, is a big mistake. And it's part of the mistake that Brexit was. We shouldn't have been trying to keep them at bay. We should have been fighting them on their own territory and calling them out all the time. And we didn't.
I want to bring you up on that. You talk about bringing people up on things, and in particular, I think, when they're spreading fiction, but they're presenting it as fact. And I was just thinking, what do you see as some of the biggest journalistic failings, but after the referendum, when suddenly we do start finding out things that we just weren't told pre or during 2016?
I've touched already on the importance of making sure that people define the words that they use themselves, and I think you can do that in a very polite way, and it's not an unreasonable request to ask somebody who has used a word which is nuanced and complicated to explain precisely what they mean by that word. The most obvious examples being control, money, borders, and laws. A little more controversially, I think that actions should have consequences. So I can make you all laugh by reminiscing about the greatest hits of David Davis, or Andrew Bridgen's recently stated belief that because he's English, he's entitled to an Irish passport. I told you I could make you laugh. But he was back on the telly the next day. He was back on the radio a week later. I mean, how gross does your discrepancy have to be before you are sufficiently discredited not to get invited onto Newsnight tomorrow or the Today programme next week? And it seems to me that if you are in public life, particularly as a politician, and you have both stated and refused to withdraw something that is demonstrably untrue. Jacob Rees-Mogg tweeted something about World Trade Organization tariffs that was, I'm positively poached in ignorance, but it had been lifted from the Sun. The Sun, of course, because they are to a degree responsible and regulated, a very small degree, but compared to Jacob Rees-Mogg, they're practically in a straitjacket. The Sun withdrew and apologized for that article, but Jacob Rees-Mogg never did. And he's never off the telly, despite having been proved wrong about a myriad of things. So I don't know how you would do it, but I think that if it was me, if they come into my studio, I would ask them to either apologize for or on the record withdraw their last falsehood and wrongdoing. Now, obviously, with some of them, you'd need an hour before you could get on with the reason that they turned up for today's interview. But this shouldn't be funny. It still makes me giggle. But Bridgen was a particularly egregious example just before Christmas, when you would have thought, wouldn't you, in a rational universe, that someone who displays a level of ignorance so utterly profound as to believe you're entitled to an Irish passport by dint of being English, that should probably be the last time he gets asked what he thinks about Brexit.
Completely. Now, I do want to go out to the audience and see if people have got questions for, preferably not myself, but either of the panelists. So, if anybody had a question to raise their hands somewhere, yeah, right in the middle, sir. I have no idea if there's a roving mic or if you just have to be really loud, I'll be honest. Oh, there is a mic. That's lucky. Feel free to just introduce yourself.
Nicholas McLean, please, can the panel comment on fact checkers? Because there was a very good moment when the Today programme had someone called Chris, who was a reliable fact checker, and he then got roasted because he was pulling someone out and showing up too much truth. And he doesn't seem to have been heard of for the last few months. Could the panel shed some light on that way of telling the truth?
I don't know if we could actually, no.
I think we'll probably be in broad agreement. I think it was Redwood, was it, who started arguing with the fact checker. I thought that was a beautiful moment. That for me was the very essence of Brexit, which was a fact checker. Who was it? Peter Lilly. So easy to get them mixed up, isn't it? And that was it for me. That was the point at which you thought you might as well pack up and go home, because they're now going to actually argue with the fact checkers. They've denied the facts. Here's the bloke who's policing the facts, and you think he's having an argument with you. It was and no one's ever heard of him since. I mean, I don't want to be self-referential, but I've, and it's a tiny little protest, like the time I boycotted Woolworths. I won't go on panel programs unless there are fact checkers there, which means I don't go on panel programs because I'm not the presenter. And if the presenter isn't going to pick up these people for the nonsense that they're talking or the ludicrous slogans that they're parroting, you're going to look like the most insufferable prig on the planet if you take it upon yourself to police the panel that you're part of. So I think Question Time, the Today programme, anyone who still buys into this ludicrous notion of equivalence. So if you've got Neil Armstrong here to talk about the moon landings, you should have someone here who denies that they ever happened. If you're going to persist in this model, which I think Trump and Brexit have broken, but if you're going to persist in it, then there should be a fact checker in every studio on the planet.
Yeah. Would you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I just add in a more general way that I've been here since about 12 o'clock and listened to about 5 of the panels, and the 2 themes that I'm picking up most strongly in terms of the disillusionment in the room is the disillusionment with Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party's position or non-position on Brexit generally, but also, and what is kind of more problematic and more saddening in a way is people's feeling towards the BBC, or what the BBC has become in the last couple of years. And of course, the curious thing about this is that both sides are furious with the BBC. Yes. You know, go follow any Brexiters' Twitter feed, and it's full of people railing about the British BBC for its pro-Remain bias, which which I don't know. Maybe it depends what program you're watching or what you're listening to. But listening to the Today program or that thing that Andrew Neil presents on a Thursday night, then it's very, very hard to see that indeed, I think. But it seems to be very clear that there is a cultural problem at the BBC at the moment, which...
Definitely.
I qualify that slightly for me in that it's the programs that manufacture debate that are the problem. It's not the news coverage and the news sourcing, I don't think. And the Brexiters who complain that the BBC are biased are complaining if the BBC reports, for example, that the head of Toyota has said that Brexit's a really bad idea. That's what the Brexiters call bias, and the rest of us call it news.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's good. And were there any other questions? I want to get a couple more in, so if we can maybe have very quick... Oh, somebody just called. Yeah, lady there? Yeah, just there? Yeah. You look surprised, but yes, you. There we are. Yeah. There we are.
I just wanted to ask James O'Brien, why do you think you are the only person that's having this rational argument about Brexit? Nobody else on your channel, nobody on the BBC, The Guardian some of the time, but that's about it. What's happened?
I will accept the premise of your question for the purposes of answering it, okay? I think I know. I think it's because I don't socialise with politicians of any hue. I haven't spent 20 or 30 years clawing my way up the ladder of the lobby. I don't seek the patronage of a politician. I don't need to interview them on my programme. I don't need to keep them sweet this week in case they won't come back next week. And this isn't self-aggrandizing, actually, but I think that the journalists that should know better have an almost existential problem with what's happened in the last 2.5 years. I've been very good friends for all of my life with Sir Bill Cash, his youngest son, and I really like Bill, but I would never want to interview him about Brexit because he's so wrong. And I like him, so I won't interview him. But if I was interviewing these people that I'd known for 20 or 30 years, and they dedicated their lives and careers to the notion that the European Union is a malevolent force dedicated to the detriment of the United Kingdom, which they believe and persist in believing. And I've treated it as a balanced argument. It has been plausible, it's been a thing, a theory, it's been feasible. The idea that it is a flush now so completely busted means they can't conduct the conversations in the way that I do, because they're friends with Peter Lilly, and John Redwood might have helped their daughter get into Oxford, or they might be looking for a quote on the back cover of their next book from David Davis or Liam Fox or something. You've got entire lives, not just the professional lives, but journalists and politicians whose entire careers have been built upon a forgivable belief that the European Union was some awful project dedicated to the erosion of Britain. It categorically isn't, but I don't think the journalists have quite got to the point where they can turn around to all their friends and contacts and colleagues and tell them honestly just how horribly wrong they've had things. But think about what it says to you. If you spent 30 years as a Eurosceptic, a decent, honourable one like Cash, not a racist clown like Farage, but a decent, honourable man like Bill Cash, his entire career has been built on sand. And I don't think they're ready to process that yet. And I don't think the journalists are either, because they're in the same boat. That's my theory, but thank you for your very flattering question.
Yeah. So that is actually the end of this conversation. I just hope everyone would join me in thanking both Jonathan and James for everything. Thank you. And I would, of course, encourage everyone to buy the books, even if James didn't bring it with him today. Please do buy both of their books. And that's us.